Recording has started.
This meeting is being broadcast on Facebook Live.
Good morning, Michael. Good afternoon, Norman. And good evening.
The Facebook Live has stopped.
Has stopped, yeah? Sorry, I think. Somla. This stopped just, Sorry. Stop just, Has stopped, love.
This meeting is being broadcast on Facebook Live. The broadcast to Facebook Live has stopped.
Stop the streams.
Some small hiccup. Good
That's
morning,
our friends from
Michael.
Beijing, I hope.
Good morning, Michael. Good afternoon, Norman. And good evening, Pandasi Kyong. Welcome to all to this panel, United States Calls on Free World to Change Chinese Communist Party, an Analysis and Prospect for Tibet. Let me start by saying welcome to our panelists and thank you for participating in this very important debate, which is not only current and topical, is very relevant to the future prospect and status of Tibet. I think there will be many Tibet-China watchers, academia, students, and other people watching and listening to this timely conference to search and dig deep into our collective blue sky thinking and horizon scanning to ask, what if? In my heart, I always believed that communism in China will come to an end at some point in time. This is not simply a wishful thinking, but it conforms to many historical facts that no regime, however successful and dreadful it may have been, eventually comes to an end. What opportunities comes from such a change will be determined by the affected population of that country. More and more countries now realize the hidden agenda of China to replace the democratic norms around the world with its own style of authoritarian and dictatorship one-party rule. This heavy-handed infiltration into other countries' governments, businesses, think tanks, civil society, and universities are recognized as security threats to many countries are beginning to push back. American pushback on China has been loud and consistent for the past few years, including intense lobbying of NATO member states and other US allies. At the Munich Security Conference of this year, the United States Defense Secretary of State Mark Esper warned the US allies to wake up to the Chinese threat. So today, we are able to discuss a possible scenario or event that a few years ago it wouldn't have even been in the mindset and thought process of the world. That event, that discussion is the call by the United States of America on the free world to change the Chinese Communist Party. There are a few significant upturns that we must observe
This meeting is being
to
broadcast
test
on Facebook Live.
whether the statement by Mike Pompeo is only a rhetoric or a serious call of statement of intent by the United States of America. Secretary of State made his speech and the call for the free world to change the CCP at the Richard Nixon's Presidential Library and Museum.
The broadcast to Facebook Live has stopped.
After half a century, 50 years of Sino-American rapprochement initiative by Henry Kissinger and President Nixon, the present United States America's President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo may have reached the conclusion that the decoupling process of Sino-American relationship could take place in the route where it started. The U.S. call on free world to change CCP is effectively, I see, a call for the change of regime. My observation is that this call is very serious, long-term intention of the United States of America, and the repercussions will be both immediate and long-term. Decoupling and conflict of these two superpowers, together with their allies, will create both opportunities as well as a state of paralysis for oppressed nations like Tibet, East Turkestan, and Southern Mongolia. Will the outcome of such an event will result in the fragmentation of the PRC, People's Republic of China, similar to that of the fragmentation of the Soviet Union? And if so, what could be the prospect for Tibet? We Tibetans, of course, have already experienced
Broadcast on Facebook Live.
the effect of huge changes of American policy way back in 1970 and 71 when the Sino-American rapprochement started. So, to illuminate our listeners and
The
viewers,
broadcast to Facebook Live has stopped.
I am delighted to have the pleasure of an extraordinarily distinguished and expert speakers to discuss and assess their views and prospect on the future status of Tibet, culminating from the U.S. call on free nations to change the Chinese Communist Party. Before I introduce the speakers, let me say we are trying to record this message, which doesn't seem to be very successful. And people who are viewing this can view this on Facebook if it eventually goes, can put their questions on the comment section of the Facebook. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lobsang Sengye. Dr. Lobsang Sengye was born and grew up in a Tibetan refugee settlement in India. From his humble beginning of his life, he has achieved much for him as well as for his people. Dr. Sengye is the president of the Central Tibetan Administration since 2011. After the announcement of full retirement of His Holiness the Dalai Lama as the temporal leader of Tibet, Dr. Sengye holds the title of Sigyong, meaning political leader of Tibet. Before joining the Central Tibetan Administration, he worked at the Harvard University as a senior research fellow after completing his master's at the Harvard Law School. Dr. Sengye is an expert on international human rights law, democratic constitutionalism, and conflict resolution. In 2007, he was selected as one of the 24 young leaders of Asia by the Asia Society. So I would like to welcome Dr. Senke to make his speech. Thank you.
Sonam Tsering, thank you so much, and I want to applaud the Office of Tibet, London, and your staff for organizing this webinar. And more than me, I'm looking forward to listening to Norman Baker and Michael Van Walt for sharing the expertise and knowledge as to how CTA and the Tibetan movement as a whole should navigate the changing geopolitics. As Sonam mentioned about the recent speeches made by leaders in Washington, D.C., Europe, and various parts of the world. So obviously there is a lot of changes that is taking place. And China is also under tremendous pressure. And how Tibetan people, as individuals, as community, as a movement, and as an administration, should navigate this and be out there in the international platform, so that the cause of Tibet and the Tibetans who are suffering in Tibet will not be forgotten, and Tibetan cause will get its due respect and support. I think with this, coronavirus, which originated in Wuhan, in China, China continues to face major backlashes. For example, in April 2020, what you call Institute of Contemporary International Relations, a
government-affiliated think tank, said that global anti-China sentiment is at its highest since 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. "Quote-unquote," a think tank in China is saying that global pandemic has created a bad image, that their PR is as bad as it was during the Tiananmen crackdown. Obviously, in 130 countries at the World Health Organization have also pressed on investigating the origin of the coronavirus. Necessary blame the people and the responsible for the pandemic. All know Chinese government did try to or hide for almost 3 to 6 weeks, and a major organization have alleged that if information was shared 3 to 6 weeks ahead by the Chinese government to the international community, then 95% of the global crisis could have been prevented. So obviously, up to or more than $9 trillion worth of loss in the global economy. It's a major loss, and it generated so much unemployment, and the youth graduate looking for jobs are finding it very difficult. Thereby, politicians also are finding it difficult to win elections or explain to the people, because whenever there are job losses, then the obviously or make the politicians hence the global leaders all over the world are also under tremendous pressure, because of which leaders around the world are trying to make Chinese government accountable. Yes, statement from Washington D.C. Makes it or rather recognizes China as competition number one, or rival number one. And last year, even the European Union rival and economic competitor. And then in January 2020, EU unveiled a recommended strategy for its member states to prevent Beijing from dominating 5G markets. And due to security the concerns, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and Romania all have signed agreements with on 5G security. And then recently at the government of the United Kingdom, I'm sure, on which Norman Baker elaborate more, they reversed the decision on 5G and role in Great Britain. So, and then there is the Alliance of Democracies called D10. 10 democratic countries will form an alliance and come together, press on Chinese government. So all these are indications that the Chinese government is pressure and international community take China accountable that they act and behave as per international norms, and they become a responsible and accountable member of the international community where liberal values, issues ought to be followed. However, the Chinese government is acting in a reverse form by cracking down on people in Hong Kong, by diluting the basic law of Hong Kong. And as you can clearly see, so many people arrested. Their, one country system as Hong Kong is being obviously now very much compromised. Now, international community is young, for more than 1 million people, and then situation well. However, there are major challenges, because when you talk about international community, let's say the United Nations, Chinese government is taking full advantage of the United Nations and putting key personnel in the United Nations, thereby the United Nations cannot act as autonomously and independently as it should be. For example, Chinese government has become the largest donor after United States. So interesting that the World Bank gives low interest loan to the Chinese government for up to almost $2 billion, whereas Chinese government gives less than $200 million to the United Nations, and they become the second largest donor. Through the funding to the United Nations, they put key people. For example, since 2019, UN Food and Agriculture Agency has been led by who was the formerly Vice Minister of Agriculture. And in 2018, Zhao Holin, who actually started his career at the China's Ministry of Post and Telecommunication, got second 4-year term as the Secretary General of International Telecommunication Union, a crucial body that sets the technical standard for communication network. And he is 5G telecommunication equipment worldwide. Again, the previous year UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres appointed Liu Zhenmin, was the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, to a key position at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And then even the International Civil Aviation Organization, which regulates global air travel, is headed by Fang Liu, who is a Chinese national. In fact, he was alleged to have, pushed Taiwan out of the, COVID-19 protocol. And then, there was a major hue and cry and protest also when China was appointed to a seat on the consultative group of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Chiang Duan, an official of the Chinese mission, in nominated and confirmed by the Asia regional groupings, and he holds a seat till March 2021. So even at the Human Rights Council, Tibetans and the Uyghurs, they want to raise a human rights violation in respective regions, they cannot, because China sits at the Rights Council and has major say. And then, that's why they are trying to restructure United Nations in their favor. They are trying to silence the voices of Human Rights Council. So on the one hand, it's true, the global environment, the democratic countries are coming together and trying to make Chinese government accountable by saying you must abide by basic human rights, democratic values, and liberal values. On the other hand, Chinese government is putting key people at the United Nations, and then you talk about WHO, and we can talk about even the World Economic Forum and so on and so forth. So hence the challenges remain. So yes, Tibetans should be more vocal, should be organizing more events and more protests. They should be more out there in the streets, and we should not limit ourselves. But the good old days of protest and activism of 90s, when Tibet issue was almost number 1 or 2 in the international forum, should be revived. So that's why not just Tibetans and our friends around the world should be more vigilant, more active, more vocal, and that's how we can take advantage of this developing scenario in the global stage, where China is increasingly coming under, and international community are making Chinese government accountable, thereby raising the issue of Tibet, Hong Kong, and so this is how we can make Chinese government accountable. Yes, good opportunities, but major challenges. Hence, I'll stop my short presentation here and look forward to listening to our very, very long-term friend, and who has shared his expertise for all these years and has been very, very helpful to the Tibetan cause. And obviously Norman Baker, who was a member of parliament and has been, very vocal, supportive, and reliable friend in UK. So I'm looking forward to two of you, and obviously if there's some questions, I'm looking to address them as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
So thank you very much, Dr. Senge. Let me introduce our second speaker, Dr. Michael van Walt Prague. Michael, I want to say a belated congratulations for the knighthood that you received from Dutch government. We have a problem in Dharamsala about going this through the Facebook. Shall we wait few minutes, or is it okay? Or It just keep coming in and out and in and out. Is it going now? Let me pause for a few minutes.
Last time when OOT London organized this, there were hacking, intervals of hacking. But it looks like now they're talking about Chinese government. I think they're hacking the whole event itself now. They're not letting us go from Blue Jeans to Facebook. Otherwise, we are on Blue Jeans, right?
Oh.
Michael, go ahead. We will record it and we will broadcast it later on Tibet TV.
Is that possible? Is that possible?
Yes, we are taping everything. We are taping everything. We'll broadcast it on
okay.
Tibet TV later.
Okay, then let's do that, yeah? Okay. So sorry, Michael. So we'll forget the Facebook. So I want to say big congratulations for Michael for his super work for foundation of the unprecedented nations and people of UNPO. So the Dutch government has very rightly knighted you for this, and I want to say a belated congratulations for you. Michael is the executive president of PRIDA, Conflict Resolution Organization, and senior fellow of the Institute for Social Science, University of California at Davis. He is a legal advisor, scholar, and one of the longest supporters of Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. For over 20 plus years, he has advised parties in peace negotiations and mediation and facilitated peace processes in various parts of the world. He has published many books and written extensively on the peaceful resolution of Tibet. His most authoritative legal book written on legal status of Tibet is called The Status of Tibet, History, Right and Prospect in International Law. So I think Michael will illuminate us on how legally and sovereignty issues should there be a breakup of PRC if the intentions of the United States and its allies succeeds in changing the CCP. So Michael, to you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, first, thank you for your congratulations and thank you for organizing this this webinar. I'm glad to be participating in it at a very important, something that seems to be a very important juncture in the situation in China and in relation to Tibet. So why do we need to speak about the status of Tibet? In the first place, because 70 years of Chinese Communist propaganda have greatly impacted people's perceptions of Tibet's status at the time of the invasion. And today, many people, including foreign ministry officials and that make policy and journalists that influence policy, assume that Tibet was part of imperial China in some way. Even some of the younger generation of Tibetans in Dharamsala are not entirely sure anymore. We need to speak about the status of Tibet today precisely to correct wrong assumptions and to take away any doubt anyone may have on this aspect of Tibet's history and Tibet's Sino-Tibetan conflict. This is critical, in particular, should the kind of developments we're discussing today indeed take place in such a way as to bring major change in China of various kinds and to the Communist Party. The window of opportunity for this kind of thing is always extremely short. And to achieve change in Tibet, things need to be in place. Tibet's status is important because it affects the Tibetan people's rights. It determines the legitimacy of Chinese rule in Tibet. It determines the obligations of the PRC under international law and the obligations of the international community, that is, all our governments, towards Tibet, the Tibetans, and the PRC. And therefore, to be clear and vocal on the status of Tibet at this juncture is critical for the Tibet movement's advocacy effort, whether or not, in fact, there is a major change in the Communist Party, but certainly if there is. And thirdly, we need to speak up about the status of Tibet because how the world's decision makers and influencers perceive the status of Tibet greatly affects the prospects of China's leaders today, or China's future leaders, if change occurs, ever being motivated to resolve the Sino-Tibetan conflicts on lines acceptable to the Tibetan people. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama stated in his 5-point peace plan speech in 1987, and I quote, "The real issue is the PRC's illegal occupation of Tibet." End of quote. This is not only the root cause of the ongoing Sino-Tibetan conflict, it is its very essence. Human rights abuses, cultural and religious destruction, environmental mismanagement need our urgent attention, but we should not lose sight of the fact that they are mere symptoms which will not go away until the illegitimacy of Chinese rule in Tibet is itself addressed. For a variety of reasons, the essence of the Sino-Tibetan conflict has all but disappeared from the discourse on Tibet. In its place have appeared notions about Tibet's history that make us doubt whether the PRC rule of Tibet and its presence there is legal or illegal. We have started to wonder whether Tibet may have been a part of China at some point in the past and are entertaining the possibility that this gives the PRC the right to rule Tibet today. Indeed, the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party, has been successful at changing the discourse in its favor on the basis of historical claims that are difficult to assess as they require extensive research on the basis of historical source materials from centuries ago and very different languages. Many people have started to doubt that it is as black and white as His Holiness characterized it, as illegal occupation. They're trying to make sense of Beijing's masterfully crafted historical claims and narrative that fits nicely in a Sino-centric rendition of Asian history that goes largely unchallenged. And they have difficulty finding solid evidence to prove that Beijing's claims misrepresent historical reality. And note, the doubt is all that Beijing needs to maintain the status quo in Tibet. Contrary to Beijing's claims, Tibet was in fact historically never part of China. This doesn't mean that Tibet was historically always independent, in the modern sense of the term. Indeed, Tibet had various relations with Mongol, Manchu, and British empires, sometimes of dependency, but none of those relations entailed the incorporation of Tibet into China. I can't enter into details in the few minutes I have to speak on the issue today, but my confidence comes from the past 10 years of solid research, which I undertook in large part as an exercise of engagement with about 100 scholars, starting with the rise of the Mongols under Genghis Khan 8 centuries ago, because that is when Beijing claims Tibet first became a part of China. My colleague Meek and I systematically assessed all claims the PRC makes regarding China's alleged historical sovereignty over Tibet, and find that none of them hold water. Tibet was not a part of China during the Mongol Empire. It did not become part of the Yuan dynasty. It was not ruled by the Chinese Ming dynasty. And the Manchu Qing emperor's relations with the Dalai Lamas in Tibet never resulted in Tibet's incorporation into China. And these conclusions are all corroborated by contemporaneous Tibetan, Mongolian, and Chinese sources. Finally, the Republic of China, the first to actually claim Tibet to be a part of China, was entirely unable to establish any authority in or over Tibet, making its claim, contradicted by the facts of Tibetan independence at the time, completely empty. Our analysis is now contained in Tibet Brief 2020. Sonam Frasi just asked me about it before we went online. It's a book we just completed, and it is now with the publisher. It's going to look something like this, the cover, and it'll be available on Amazon bookstores in October. And it presents the Chinese claims and debunks them on the basis of both historical and legal analysis. In Tibet Brief 2020, we demonstrate that Tibet today is an occupied country. The PRC's presence in Tibet is illegal because its armed invasion of Tibet in 1950-51 violated one of the most fundamental norms of modern international law, namely the prohibition of the use of force against another state. Tibet was not part of China when the PLA invaded it, and under international law, a state cannot acquire sovereignty over a territory seized by force or by threat of force. This has consequences for the rights of the Tibetan people, and, as I said earlier, for the international legal obligations of other states today, all addressed in the book as well. To summarize these consequences, the Tibetan people have the right to exercise full self-determination. The PRC is required under international law to end the occupation of Tibet and to allow the Tibetans to exercise their right to self-determination. And all of our governments have the duty specifically not to recognize the illegal annexation of Tibet by China and not to cooperate or assist Beijing in any way in maintaining or consolidating its unlawful rule of Tibet or in exploiting Tibet's natural resources, resources which under international law belong solely to the Tibetan people. Many governments have violated a core rule of international law, which in fact forbids states from recognizing an acquisition of territory by the use of force. And many of them act in ways that in fact help Beijing to consolidate its rule in Tibet, or to deny the Tibetans the right to self-determination, or to exploit the country's resources, all of which also violate international law. But legal obligations are not the only reason governments do well to course correct on their Tibet policy today. Besides legal and moral imperatives, it is in the international community's own best interest to effectively address the Sino-Tibetan conflict. Not doing so and looking the other way has emboldened Beijing to assert expanding territorial claims, as we all know, and influence. Beijing reignited territorial claims in the South China Sea, in northern India, even in Bhutan, its exertion of undue influence in Nepal and Mongolia, as well as its violation of Hong Kong's guaranteed autonomy, its mass incarceration of Uyghurs, cannot be treated as unrelated to the years of international appeasement of Beijing as concerns its unlawful seizure and occupation of Tibet, as well as its implementation of oppressive policies of integration and assimilation in Tibet. A drive to bring about change in China is an opportunity for governments to course correct on Tibet now. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your such eloquent and wealth of information, a wealth of knowledge. It's always a privilege to hear you. So before I dwell too much on this, Michael, let me introduce our third speaker, Norman Baker. Norman Baker is a long-time supporter of Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He was a former president of the Tibet Society, the world's oldest Tibet Society, Tibet Support Group. He was also a member of the All-Party Parliament Group for Tibet in the House of Commons in the Westminster Parliament. He has also written many articles on human rights and abuse of Chinese-occupied Tibet. Norman had a long-standing parliamentarian career representing the Liberal Democratic Party of the United Kingdom. In his illustrious career in the Westminster Parliament, he held the position of Minister of State at the Home Office in the coalition government of 2010 to 2015. So, I hope Norman Baker will give us a small hint as to how and will the capitals in the Western Europe and London will take on the challenge that America is calling for in changing the Communist Party of China. Norman, to you now.
Sonam, thank you very much indeed. And let me say, first of all, it's a pity that we're having interference on Facebook Live, but I hope very much that we will take the opportunity to use every social media channel there is, whether it's YouTube or via our support network, Free Tibet, the ICT in America, or anybody else, to get this webinar broadcast. As a believer in free speech, I don't think we should be having people interfering with what we're saying. Secondly, let me say how pleased I am to be able to follow Michael, whose book, The Status of Tibet, may sound dry, but actually is rather, for me anyway, rather fascinating and extremely well written and very competently written. And he puts the case very well. And he's absolutely right to say that what has happened in the past should not be rewritten by the Chinese government without being challenged. And here in the UK, we're in a very strong position to be able to challenge the lies that come from the Beijing government about the history of Chinese involvement with Tibet. And that's because the British had a habit of wandering around the world in the 19th century and early 20th century, inviting ourselves into countries, mainly for trade purposes. And we were a presence in independent Tibet. We were there. We signed the Lhasa Convention in 1904 with the Tibetan government, not with the Chinese government, with the Tibetan government. We were there to sign a similar convention in 1914 with the Tibetans, not with the Chinese, with the Tibetans. We were there. We saw the independent Tibetan government. We saw the independent foreign policy. We saw the Tibetan currency, the Tibetan stamps. We saw that Tibet was an independent nation, and that must not be forgotten. And Britain is uniquely placed to be able to give evidence to that effect from our archives, from the historical record, and we should be doing far more of that, in my view, than we are doing at the present time. Now, we've seen the world turn in a helpful way, as Dr. Sangay has very clearly indicated, to begin to have doubts about the direction of China. And that's wholly right, that the world should do that. Back to 1971 and Richard Nixon, and there was a theory, I think, in the democratic West, that if only we would engage with China, then they would be reformed, they would become more democratic. And as their economy improved, the individual members of the population of China would demand human rights, and that was a way to reform China. We had the same theory with the Olympics, the Chinese Olympics, that only if we let the Chinese have the Olympics in Beijing, that would open up China to the world and China would reform. Actually, we've not seen that at all. And what successive Chinese governments have concluded, particularly the present one under Xi Jinping, is that these are signs from the West of weakness. They regard that not as a conciliatory hand, but as weakness. And the Chinese do not respect that. And therefore, a different approach has to be taken. It is not in my natural approach to life to be confrontational. I'm a liberal and I look for consensus. But you cannot have consensus unless the other side also wants consensus, and the Chinese government does not. They regard consensus seeking as weakness. So that's why, when we look at the American response, the American government response, the American democratic response, that I support that. It's the only thing I think that President Trump does that I actually support, because he and his administration, Mike Pompeo and others, have taken a view that if we don't change communist China, they will change us. They will change the world. And we already see the capacity for the Chinese government to do this through its infiltration of, for example, technology, and to behave in a way that is deeply antagonistic to Western democratic ideals. And therefore we have to take this on. And it's great that in the US we have almost uniquely a common purpose between the Republicans and Democrats to take this forward. And that, Sonam, to come up to your point, gives an opportunity for other Western governments in the EU, the UK, our friends in Australia, New Zealand and Canada and elsewhere, and I hope in due course in India and other major countries of the world, to say to the Chinese, this far and no further. You have to stop here. We're not going to tolerate this erosion of our values anymore. Now, we've seen the world change, not because of Tibet, sadly, but we are seeing it change at the moment because of the appalling way in which the Chinese government is dealing with the Uyghurs in East Turkestan and the clumsy, clod-hopping way in which they're dealing with Hong Kong. And those two elements of geography have, I think, woken up not simply governments in the West, but woken up the populations as well. And indeed, I might say probably as well woken up the Chinese diaspora, at least, who are able to access the facts, unlike the sad population of China itself, which is fed lies and propaganda continually by the Chinese government to prevent it from finding out the facts. So that's the good news. And I think that Tibet's opportunity comes now, renewed opportunity comes on the back of the world waking up to the appalling situation in East Turkestan and the threat to democracy, well, very real threat, in Hong Kong. And I might just say that when you read of and see pictures of the concentration camps in East Turkestan, when you see people being herded blindfold onto trains to take them to these concentration camps, when you learn of the US intervening and into a ship on its way to the US carrying, I think, 13 tons of human hair taken from the Uyghurs. What does that remind you of? That is what happened in Nazi Germany, and it's not too strong a point to make. This is a threat to our world, and Nazi Germany ended up in war with the world because the world did nothing very much about it, and we have to make sure the same thing doesn't apply with China, the Republic of China today, and its ghastly government of gangsters which traipses over decent human rights that other people respect. Now, there are various things that we need to be doing in the UK and the EU needs to be doing as well, and some of them are now taking place. First of all, we need to mirror the US with the Magnitsky Act. This is an act which, as you know, imposes sanctions upon individual members of the Chinese government who behave in ways which we regard as reprehensible and unacceptable. The UK government has now adopted that in respect of certain individuals from Russia and from Saudi Arabia, but needs to go further now to make sure we extend that to Chinese officials as well. Secondly, we need to push reciprocal access to Tibet, which is something, again, the US has been leading on. And in the British Parliament, my former colleague on the All-Party Tibet Group, Tim Lawton, who chairs that group, has introduced a bill to require the British government to impose that reciprocal access. Now, that bill has not been adopted by the British government yet, but it should be, because that's entirely proper. Why should we allow Chinese journalists to wander freely all over Britain? I'm very happy for them to do so, but then accept that we don't have the same right for journalists and indeed diplomats to enter Tibet. Now, when I was a minister and I was in China, I asked to go to Tibet. You won't be surprised to know that. I was told I could go no further west than Chongqing. That's where my boundary was, apparently, decided by the Chinese government. Why should we accept these restrictions which they want to apply unilaterally? Why should we accept one rule for them and one rule for everybody else? The answer, of course, is we shouldn't. And the third issue, which we need to be very, very firm on, is the issue of the succession to His Holiness. And I'm very pleased that we've seen the EU and the US take steps now to make it very, very clear we will not accept a Chinese imposition of a fake Dalai Lama, as they have imposed a fake Panchen Lama. And it's very important the world says this very clearly, and it's very important that any Chinese officials who attempt to be part of this fiasco of appointing their own Dalai Lama should be subject to a Magnitsky Act condition. They should have to pay for that personally. And the idea, I might say, the ultimate in absurdity, the idea that an atheist communist state should say it has to give permission for someone to reincarnate. I mean, that is just beyond satire. So the world needs to take a very firm view on that as well. But there's more that needs to be done. And Dr. Sanghi absolutely correctly referred to the insidious way in which the Chinese government intervenes and makes itself inveigle itself into various UN bodies, or inveigle itself into think tanks and different bits of public society in a way, of course, that we could not inveigle ourselves if we tried to in Chinese society. And one of those, quite clearly, is in universities. And you will know, Sonam, that I produced not very long ago a report into the Confucius Institutes here in the UK, which demonstrated they were not mild and harmless. They were being used quite clearly as propaganda tools for the government in Beijing. And they were telling their students that Taiwan was part of China. This is simply not true. And we need to challenge these. They were even producing maps at one university I know of showing Taiwan now as part of China. They cannot be allowed to get away with lies like this. So we need to have much firmer rules for our universities, and we need to stop the idea that if they give us money, we will then shut up, which is the deal which the Chinese government wants to impose on our universities. And I refer to a piece in The Guardian, you probably can't see that, a piece in The Guardian, how fake award for a tycoon left Oxford University open to Chinese influence. And they've given a meaningless certificate to a Hong Kong businessman with links to the Communist Party in hope of receiving cash donations. This is terrible. This is compromising academic freedom and values in order to get money. We should stop that. That's a matter for us to stop that. We can do that right away. We need to educate our parliamentarians more. And the All-Party Group in Westminster, which I was very pleased to be part of, kept the flame flying, kept the flame alive and the flag flying, but it didn't do as much as I would have liked it to do. But now the opportunity is there, and there's a new group of the British Parliament called the China Research Group, chaired by a Conservative MP, which is very, very sceptical of what China is doing in a whole range of ways. Again, the Sikyong referred quite rightly to Huawei. And my view, which I've been very clear about, and there's a view shared by many parliamentarians, is that we should not allow the Chinese government or Chinese companies into our national infrastructure, our critical infrastructure. It's absolutely wrong they should be part of our telecommunications. It's absolutely wrong they should be part of our nuclear plant, our nuclear secrets. This is madness to let these people in. Because you have to assume, whatever Huawei says, you have to assume these days that any Chinese company, whether it claims to be independent or not, is going to be an arm of the Chinese state. Even if it wants to be independent, they will be required by Chinese law to pass over information to the Chinese government. So any Chinese company should be treated as part of the Chinese government. That's the only safe way of behaving. Now, how can we take this forward in a productive way? First of all, I've mentioned the three things we need to do immediately: the Magnitsky Act, Reciprocal Access Act, and making very clear our position on the succession of the Dalai Lama. And add to that being very firm and closing down, if necessary, the Confucius Institutes, which operate in this country and other Western countries as well. But there's something else we need to do as well. We need to engage with other governments in a far more coordinated way than we have done. And to that end, it's very sad, in my view, that the UK has left the European Union, but we can still work with them on these foreign policy objectives. We need to make sure we pull in other countries as well. I'd like to see India far more involved. India is very vulnerable, as Dr. Sangay will know, in terms of the water supply, the Chinese dams which are being constructed and drying up the rivers in northern India, and also, of course, the border villages now being constructed along the Chinese border in Tibet, and of course the fact that we had that incursion which led to a confrontation between the Chinese and Indians quite recently. So we need to get the Indian government, I think, more involved. They don't want to necessarily antagonise the Chinese, but they have to, like everybody else, realise that doing nothing is not an option anymore. We have to make sure that we engage with the Chinese people insofar as we can, because I don't believe that the Chinese government represents the Chinese people. They may have been brainwashed and fed a whole lot of lies, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be decent people like anybody else in the world. Particularly, we can engage with the Chinese diaspora in Western countries. We can engage with people in Hong Kong. We can engage with people in Taiwan. And we should use social media channels where they're not blocked to get to the Chinese people themselves in mainland China. Because ultimately, my view is that you can put a ring round China and you can protect your national infrastructure. You can make sure that you push back at the UN and so on. But in terms of changing the government in China, that's going to have to come from inside. The Soviet Union government changed because of Gorbachev. The Chinese government will have to find its own Gorbachev to change. So what we have to do is to protect ourselves, protect our human rights, continue to make sure we push back on the propaganda, continue to make sure we push back on their infiltration, which is like a cancer in international bodies, and in the meantime do our best, if we can, to try and educate the Chinese people who have been fed all these pack of lies, and to encourage them to eventually replace Xi Jinping, the butcher of Beijing, and his colleagues, his henchmen, with a government more open to reason and to respecting human rights. I think it's a long battle. It's a long battle. It will not be won overnight, but we have to all engage in it now in a coordinated way. And I think if we do that, then we can eventually win. As you said, Sonam, at the beginning, no government lasts forever. No empire lasts forever. So let us now limit the damage which the government in Beijing can do, and let's push back on that. And let's then wait for the day, which will come, when this ghastly government in Beijing is no more.
Thank you very much, Norman. Always interesting, and what an insight you have given us to think it over. But so we are not going to have many questions from our viewers, because I think we are unable to go live today. But I think, in essence, I would like to ask all three of you to ask this question once again. Will the call from the America is a credible request or credible scenario that the world could see, or world could actually have the possibility to change Chinese Communist Party? Let me go first to Dr. Sengela.
I think yes. Norman Baker mentioned 1970s. There was a theory, essentially, authored by Henry Kissinger, that engagement with China and cooperation with China make Chinese government responsible, member of the international community. So if you engage with them, they will be more like us, in that sense, following democratic values, respecting human rights and environmental issues. But over the last, nearly 40 years, now Washington, D.C. has come to consensus that is not cooperation but competition. Chinese government is engaging full throttle, compete with America. So before it was mainly the security wing, which was calling for competition or look at China as adversary, But now recently, even within the administration, the trade secretary, the economic secretary, even those who favored or rather were pro-engagement have come to conclusion that no, we should compete with China. So even many business people, American business people who invested in China initially made profits, right? A majority have come to conclusion that they have less opportunities and less profit, and many of them were either co-opted or their know-hows, their technological know-hows were stolen. Chinese are far ahead in economic terms as well. So that's why this Washington consensus, I think, is real deal. So it doesn't matter which party comes to power, but generally to view China as a competition will continue. So in that sense, it's real. So the fact that they mentioned and highlight the issues of Uyghurs and people in Hong Kong are also real. So recently, Pompeo said either we change China or China will change you. I think it's similar rhetoric. I think, we have been saying this for the last 60 years, to be careful with what you're dealing with the promises the Tibetans, the promises made to Tibetans were all violated. So we are the ones who got betrayed, the first victim of all the promises. So in fact, in 2018 at Geneva Forum, I said, and it's quoted in Tibet.net, either we transform China or China will transform us, was what I said in 2018. So, 2 years later, to hear Secretary of State Pompeo to say that either we change China or China will change us is exactly the same rhetoric, right? I'm not claiming any credit here, but what I'm trying to say is the sentiments that we had, what we had been saying in the international forum for the last 60 years is being now subscribed to by Washington, D.C., essentially, many members of the European Union, let's say what Germany will do, and then Australia and maybe hopefully New Zealand and other like-minded countries as well. So yes, I think, I don't know how far the decoupling will take place, how far the Cold War, quote-unquote, Cold War will go on, but the realization in Washington, D.C. and many Western countries, not just in the security affairs, not just in intelligentsia, academia, but generally a consensus is what Tibet and Tibetans have been saying was true, and we should subscribe to that theory and support.
Thank you.
No. Unmute.
Oh. Michael, can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Yes. Can I ask the same question?
Yes, you can. Yeah, exactly as Sikyong states, this has been something that Tibetan leaders, but that others have also been saying for a long time. So it is good that now there is a consensus among US politicians, and in particular, as Sikyong says, a consensus that is supported by an important part of the business community, because that drives a lot of politics, especially in the US. I think in Europe also there is a growing realization that the hope everybody had of not only of China and the Communist Party changing on its own volition because of its interaction with the rest of the world, and because of its growing responsibility in the world, that has not happened, but also this imagination of an enormous market that everybody in the West would become wealthy because they could sell toothbrushes to every Chinese individual or radios to every Chinese individual or whatever, is also not becoming a reality and is never going to be a reality. So I think these changes are real. People are realizing them, and that is changing. It is opening up the opportunity for them to see relations with China differently, on a more even basis, on a more realistic basis, but also to see the dangers of a China that sees itself as a not just as a growing power, as a rising power, as it admits itself, but as a superpower that is going to transform international institutions that we've relied on, certainly since the Second World War and perhaps earlier, change international law, change international norms to its own benefit, to its own needs, to support its agenda, which is certainly to be a controlling power in Asia, but also beyond that. And I mentioned in my earlier remarks the South China Sea push of the PRC, and in northern India. I think these are two very important signs of a degree of self-confidence that is very dangerous. The extent to which the rest of the world has reacted to these developments, in my view, is insufficient. We have not been able to send a clear message that this is just unacceptable. Instead, we've really simply said you can't go beyond what you've done. So, for example, in other words, I think that we need to move, and by we I mean the governments of many countries in the world, need to move beyond the position that we want to retain the status quo to a position where some of the advances that the PRC has made, and I include Tibet in that, and its undue influence in Nepal, I include in that as well, and its moves in Hong Kong, need to be reversed. And the same with South China Sea. China has built islands in areas that are not under international law, under its sovereignty. It has violated rules that we've all agreed on the law of the sea. And the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague has made that clear. We are not forcing China to pull back and restore things as they were before in the South China Sea, in Tibet, in Hong Kong. We are simply saying don't go beyond this. And I think that is a mistake. So I hope that this change of attitude internationally is going to make pushing back a possibility. I don't think that the Chinese leadership of the Communist Party is really going to listen and take change of policy seriously until it sees that these things are actually being pushed by the US, by European countries, hopefully by Japan, and I think very importantly by India. And India, if it feels itself strengthened by other countries holding its back, India will be in a better position to not be alone in its struggle to regain some lost ground in relation to China. But I think key in all this is Tibet, and I think that we need to ensure that Tibet is brought back in the center of the discourse for the reasons that Si Kyung says, that it has been, Tibetans have a history now of 70 years of experience in the kinds of policies that we're seeing now being carried out in Hong Kong against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. These are not new things. The Gulag was in Amdo for decades. So the experience has been there. And in my view, one of the important things that governments could do is start questioning the legitimacy of China's rule in Tibet. That will send a very strong signal about their seriousness of also questioning the legitimacy of China's behavior in Hong Kong and the legitimacy of China's claims to Taiwan and to the South China Sea. And who knows, in future, there may even, if the world does not react properly, there may be very similar claims made to Mongolia as have been made to Tibet.
Thank you, Michael. I'll ask Norman to also the same question.
Very happy to answer that. And in terms of the US, I think the unfortunate matter at the moment is that the US government is not liked around the world, and Donald Trump is not trusted on many issues, although I happen to think he's right on this one. So the real test will come if he loses the election and indeed accepts he's lost the election, which I think he will lose it. And then we see what President Biden does, because that's the key point, is whether the US continues down this robust line, which I support, or whether it doesn't. So I think probably the jury's out until that point. But if it does carry on after the November election, then it'll be very clear to the world, and China in particular, that the US position isn't changing. And I don't think it necessarily will change because, as I mentioned earlier on, there is a degree of unanimity between the two parties in the US on this issue, thankfully. I agree very much with what Michael just said about the need to push back. And, without over-egging the historical parallels, when you have a government which is run by gangsters and out of control, then they will try and access land which isn't theirs. And we saw this with the German government in the 1930s. And they went into places like the Sudetenland and waited to see what the world would do. And when the world does nothing, these sorts of people are encouraged to go even further. They don't say, oh, that's enough. They say, okay, the world's done nothing, where can we go next? Then they Anschluss with Austria, and you end up with Poland being invaded. This is the danger with this mindset, that you have to challenge it and not hope it stops where it is. That would be a rational, reasonable approach, but that's not what we have, ration or reason, from the Chinese government. Two other points, but make quickly. One is that I've been disappointed that we haven't seen a reaction from others around the world who ought to be objecting to the way in which religions are kind of trampled all over in China, whether it's Buddhists elsewhere, whether it's the Muslim communities in particular in the Middle East, or indeed even Christian countries. We should be far more willing to defend the right of religion across the world. And unfortunately, what countries, especially in the Middle East, are doing, are saying, okay, give us your money and we'll keep quiet. That's not a deal which has got any sense in the short term, let alone the long term. And lastly, the point I wanted to make right at the beginning, I forgot. I think language is important, and we should talk continually, all of us, about occupied Tibet. Not just Tibet, about occupied Tibet, because that's what it is. It's an occupied country. We should always preface the word Tibet with the adjective occupied.
Thank you, Norman. I think we got about 15 minutes. What I want to do is maybe ask a question for a short answer but short answer for this will be very difficult. Maybe I'll ask Michael on this. Michael, given the lots of efforts put by Chinese government in wiping the real history and rewriting it in their terms, what are your views on it, and how can we effectively deal with this about Tibetan history written by China? It's a very complicated.
Well, it is very complicated, and at the same time, it is very simple. I mean, we can go back in history all the time, all the way back to the Mongols, or even before, to show that Tibet was not a part of China. But we can also simply say this: before China, before the PRC invaded Tibet in 1950, 1951. Before the 17-point agreement was forced on Tibetans, Tibet was an independent country. One doesn't even need to go back into history beyond beyond the early 20th century. Norman gave good examples of treaties that Tibet concluded. These are things that you cannot do if you're not an independent state. And Britain and India in particular have a responsibility in this regard, because they have benefited directly from the treaties they concluded bilaterally with Tibet. And under international law, if you have benefited from a treaty, you cannot afterwards say that there is some invalidity to it. You cannot say, well, Tibet wasn't quite independent, because that means the treaty was not valid, and that means that the recognition that both Britain and India gave to Tibet as an independent country, as a signatory to a treaty, cannot be withdrawn later, because they have benefited from it. So all I'm saying is we don't need to go into all the intricacies of the history to make the point that China's invasion of Tibet was illegal, and that its occupation, which it is an occupation, and Norman is completely right that we should always preface Tibet by occupied Tibet, that is illegitimate, and that China simply has no legitimacy to rule Tibet. What can we do? I think we all, not just governments, but individuals, scholars and others, need to constantly challenge the narrative that we're being fed by China at every opportunity. And we see constantly now in newspapers and even some Tibetan support group people inadvertently saying, there's no, you simply assuming language that implies that Tibet is part of China today. Tibet is not part of China today. It is de facto being controlled by China, but it is not legally part of China. And I think we need to insist on that. We need to tell journalists, look, there's a mistake in your article when you say that Tibet is part of China today, or when you say that Tibet was part of some empire in the past of the Chinese empire in the past. These are assumptions people make simply because we've been fed this information too often, and because it hasn't been often enough effectively challenged. So I think a short answer is challenge and keep challenging it.
Thank you, Michael. This is a question probably is a little bit hypothetical, but I would like to ask this question to Dr. Lobsang Sengye. In the event, I'm coming back to this topic, in the event there was a breakup of PRC, will that mean removal of the Communist Party alone? And in that case, with all the different parts of Tibet, which are sitting in different provinces of China, how a consolidation of an effective Tibetan country or nation could one construe out of a breakup of PRC? Sorry.
That's an
examination
question. Yes. too big a hypothetical. But having said that, I mean, you can learn lessons. Let's say after the collapse of the Soviet Union, let's take the example of Ukraine. Ukraine has 20% of the Russian population. So even Russia, doesn't matter, even though Russia as a nation, the Communist Party of Russia continue to exist, and in fact is the ruling party of Russia. So similarly, whatever happens in China, we must assume that the Communist Party of China will continue as the one-party ruler or one of the major political parties. So, Communist Party will continue to be there in China. So that's the assumption we should make. And there will be some elements within the Tibetan community who will be, leaning towards communism and communist ideology and Communist Party. So that is also a scenario we should, assume that whatever happens in the future, we are not going to get Tibet or China on a clean slate, and then we can start, whatever or whichever way we want. I think reality is, we just have to look at, all these republics, and Communist Party even exists in some of these, broken away independent, countries, which were formerly part of Soviet Union. So that's why, middle way approach, is a realistic approach, always trying to find a middle ground, no matter what the circumstances is. Now, having said that, I agree with Sonam. We all should call Sir Michael Van Walt. He's now knighted. So what Sir Michael Van Walt said, historically, Tibet was an independent country, and we are entitled to have independence from a historical point of view. Based on international law, we are entitled to have self-determination. Having said that, based on what the Chinese government is saying, that sovereignty and territorial integrity cannot be compromised, we are, coming out with a win-win proposition, win for China, win for us. So the narrative has to be set right. Otherwise, Chinese government keeps saying that Tibet was always part of China, and we keep saying we are not seeking independence, that the dominant narrative will be, Tibet was not part of China, and Tibetans are seeking genuine autonomy. So rather than what we are seeking is less than what is legally and historically ours. That will make us sound reasonable. So that's the narrative we must come up with. So yes, whatever happens in the future, reality is reality. Communist Party of China will be there in one form or the other. And we have to deal with this. Now, I think, both Norman Baker and Michael mentioned a very important point, India. India has a major role. And recent event, as you know, the tragedy. After 40 years, there was a violence at the border of India, and 20 Indian soldiers were really brutally killed. And it's not a gunfight. Normally at the border, if there are any conflicts, you expect gunfight. No, this is like thuggish way of killing people with rods and with barbed wire. So after that, there's really a month and a half, in fact 2 months long, debate in all the Indian media, whether you're liberal, conservative, right-wing, left-wing, doesn't matter. Huge debate. And I think, really high level of resentment towards what the Chinese army did to Indian soldiers. So I participated in, I think, I've appeared on 45 to 46 or 7 national televisions in India as a marathon of appearances. So for the second generation or the younger generation of Indians, there is awareness now and growing realization that Tibet was and is and should be an important component in Indo-China factor, because practically there was never a border between India and China. It was always border between Tibet and India. So 3,500 long kilometers land border was always between Tibet and India. Tibet, Tibet acted as the buffer zone, as a zone of peace. With demilitarized border, there was any expenses. Now all these tensions happened after the illegal occupation of Tibet. And part of the blame lies with the Indian government also, because they said Tibet was an autonomous region of China, and later they said Tibet was and is part of China. So thereby legitimizing, justifying the Chinese presence in Tibet and Chinese military presence at the border. So I've been saying this. You should not say Indo-China border. Once you say Indo-China border, Chinese soldiers will come to your border and claim this is this is our land. And if you say why, because you say it's China's border, and that's why Chinese soldiers say here. You are, in a sense, inviting them by calling Indo-China's border. You should say always Indo-Tibet border. So I think there's a huge discourse, huge realization. So that's a good thing, because the largest number of Tibetans are in India, CTA is based in India, and most importantly, His Holiness Dalai Lama has been a proud resident of India for the last 60 years. So this is a new realization, and first, Indian government banned 49 apps from China, including WeChat and TikToks, and way before America took the initiative, and later they added 100 plus more apps. So this is a very muscular, assertive, foreign policy of Indian government towards the Chinese government.
Thank you, Dr. Senge. To be equal, I want to ask one question to Norman Baker, and I hope his answer will be short so that we can wrap up this on time. Although the Secretary of State Pompeo hasn't spelled out the call out for the allies to change, but how do you think this call from America will be received and given assistance to effectively be with America to make the change? Will the European countries be with America, or they will look at the other side?
Well, you're asking a politician or a former politician for a short answer, so I'll do my best to break the tradition on that. Sonam, well, I think I answered it in the sense already that the European Union, I think, is beginning to come to the conclusion itself, as is the UK, that business as normal doesn't work. It doesn't deliver what we want, and it's dangerous because it allows the infiltration into our values and institutions of this cancer from the Beijing government. So I think Europe is waking up itself. As regards America, Europe needs to have better relations with America, but in my view that will only come about when we have a new American president who's prepared to re-establish business somewhat as normal. I can understand the American attitude towards the frustration with, say, the World Health Organization, which I do believe was leading towards China over the COVID-19 problem. But, the answer is not to take your ball home, because the Americans walking out of these institutions simply leaves them more dependent than ever on Chinese money and takes away the American influence. So we should not be walking away from UN institutions. We should be getting stuck into them and making sure that Western values triumph.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it, yeah?
Is that short enough for you?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I think this has been a wonderful session. I'm very upset that it hasn't gone live with the questions that and our viewers can hear. But whatever the case, whatever may happen, and all the inputs that all three of you have given, it has been a memorable evening, and I hope, as Dr. Sengela said, he will make this available on the internet so that people can hear, because there's a huge amount of knowledge and expertise spelled out on this. I would like to say it is going to be a very interesting few coming years. And this change in policy of America, I hope it will continue and it will rub on other nations which will also take a different and similar line to America, who has the ability to change China. As for the Tibetan diaspora, we will be also lots of changes coming through. We will have a new Sikyong from next year, a new administration, and it is imperative that whoever comes into office has the ability to bring the Tibet case right in the forefront of the international community, because this is an opportunity that Tibetans can't and must not miss, because this is a very, very important time, I feel. So with these new opportunities, it will be there, and it will be our responsibility, as you have said, how to take it, and we will be able to grab it if the chance comes. So with this, I want to say thank you so much for all your wonderful sharing of knowledge and expertise, and huge amount of work that has gone through. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving your time. Thank you very much from the Office of Tibet.
Yeah, I just want to, I just want to applaud Representative Sonam Phasila and his staff for organizing this, and especially thanks to Honorable Norman Baker and Sir Michael Van Walt for being with us for all these years. I always say the friends like you are rare, and your gray hair doesn't reflect your age, but reflects your wisdom. That is very much needed at this, at this time. With the major shift in geopolitics, I think everybody wants to know about and deal with China. And we are the veterans. The Tibetans have been the first victim. At the same time, we are the veterans in understanding China. So our wisdom and knowledge is very much needed at this time, and it will really help the international community also how best to, make Chinese government accountable and a responsible member of the international community. So yes, we will edit this part and then, upload in our Facebook, Tibet TV, and I can assure you, at least 10,000 or more Tibetans and friends from all over the world will watch and appreciate your efforts and input. So good night from Dharamsala, and good morning to Michael, and good afternoon to Norman and Office of Tibet in London. So it has been a pleasure just sharing this, platform. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonam Tsering.
Belek.
Stop.